is the long way around. I'm your host, Malcolm Byrne, and you're listening to Radio Kingston, WKNY, 107.9 AM. Pardon me, I always do this. 107.9 FM, 1490 AM, and at radiokingston.org. Hope everybody's doing well. I'm waiting for my guest, Kevin Gosztola, to sign on to the show. But in the meantime, while I wait for him, Kevin is the author of a new book called Guilty of Journalism, The Political Case Against Julian Assange. But in the meantime, while I wait for him, I'm going to play a track from a playlist that Kevin graciously sent to me earlier. This is a track by David Rovics called Behind These Prison Walls.
Prison walls, there's a man who's won awards for the work that he has done and all that it affords, such as the knowledge of the harbors committed in our name. They can't stop the message, so the messenger gets blamed. Behind these prison walls, in solitary confinement, in a land of rolling hills and royalty and other such refinement, is someone who is a hero to whistleblowers everywhere, who helped them tell the world of the crimes of Tony Blair. Behind these prison walls, you will find a mortal man, the reason why we know what happened in Afghanistan, when the soldiers of the empire, whose sons had long before were torturing civilians in their terror war. Behind these prison walls is a part of WikiLeaks, an eloquent orator, but you won't hear him speak. Locked away in silence, one who knows too well how those in power act when there's another war to sell. Behind these prison walls is one who stands accused of exactly what offenses the U.S. has refused to say precisely which, or to try to clear the mist, or to explain how he's not the same as other journalists. Behind these prison walls is a person they deprive of most of the things in life that keep us all alive. A person being tortured as we stand here now for revealing the war crimes. Why, when, where, how? Behind these prison walls our very right to be informed of what the hell is going on. Is the teacup in this storm? With knowledge there is power, so the solution by the crown. A 24-hour-a-day indefinite lockdown behind these prison walls.
That was Behind These Prison Walls, written and performed by David Rovics. And before I bring Kevin into the show, I just want to read you his bio. Kevin Gosztola has spent the last decade reporting on Julian Assange, and I'm sure if you were listening, you realize that's exactly what that song was, who that song was talking about in his dire predicament here on the 4th anniversary of his incarceration in Belmarsh Prison. WikiLeaks and the wider war on whistleblowers anyway, Kevin is co-founder and managing editor of Shadowproof, an independent news outlet focused on systemic abuses of power in business and government, and the curator of the Dissenter newsletter. He also produces and co-hosts the weekly podcast Unauthorized Disclosure. His work has appeared in outlets such as The Nation, Salon, Common Dreams, and Truth Out, and he's been a featured guest on Democracy Now!, The Real News Network, Counterspin, and Al Jazeera English. Kevin previously co-authored with Greg Mitchell Truth and Consequences, the U.S. versus Private Manning, published by Sinclair Books in 2012. Kevin's new book is entitled Guilty of Journalism, The Political Case Against Julian Assange, which was just published by the Censored Press and Seven Stories Press. Kevin Gosztola, welcome to The Long Way Round, sir.
Hey, thank you for having me tonight.
Well, it's I have to say it's a real honor to have you on the show. I'm a huge admirer of your work, and I find that your most recent book one of the most compelling and informative books I've read on the case of Julian Assange, and it's often very useful in my counter discussions with people who claim that Julian deserves to be in prison, and have sort of bought into the negative image that has been created by the media about him. The other thing I wanted to just briefly mention is I listened earlier today to your interview with, speaking of the great godfather of whistleblowers, really, Daniel Ellsberg. So I appreciated hearing that. Thank you so much.
Well, I have to return the gratitude. It means a lot to hear that kind of praise from you, and you work so hard to put this together. I spent almost all of 2022 on this project. So this is the part where all that hard work pays off, and we get to share it and make sure that people are able to use it to better their understanding. But then also, I hope it in some small way contributes to people recognizing that, we need the Justice Department to actually stand up for press freedom and no longer pursue this case.
Yeah, it's difficult for me to talk about this subject without getting very emotional. It almost, even hearing that track brought tears to my eyes. I feel, as many of us do, a personal affinity with Julian, in the sense that his cause is our cause. I'd like to just quote, it's kind of sometimes interesting to work backwards. I want to quote from the very ending of your book, actually, in the conclusion. I just want to read this little passage to give the listeners sort of a greater sense of where things are at and where they're going. On page 250, you write, "The First Amendment of the United States Constitution explicitly protects freedom of the press because those who colonized the United States viewed the Fourth Estate as essential to the ability of the government governed to hold those in power accountable. U.S. citizens are supposed to have the right to share information and be free from censorship. If a non-U.S. citizen, such as Assange, is subject to U.S. laws, which on its own is an extraordinary and troubling development, then at the very least he should be afforded the same constitutional rights every U.S. citizen supposedly enjoys. And then the very last passage of your book states, even if Julian Assange is not convicted at trial, this political case has already set an alarming precedent. We could all be guilty of journalism. Could you explain that last statement?
When I wrote that, it was kind of a throwaway message at the end. However, I think with the events of the past week,
yes,
which have been in the news, where we have an Espionage Act prosecution, and there's a lot of complexities. I don't want to conflate the two cases, Assange, and I'm talking about this Air National Guard reservist, Jack Teixeira, 21 years old, very, very young man, obviously still trying to find his foothold in life, going through what it's like to be indoctrinated into military culture and dealing with access to information, having millions of secrets at his fingertips, just like Chelsea Manning, just like Edward Snowden, wanting in some way to have what I take away from what we've learned about him, aside from some of the more controversial aspects, is that he was reading these documents on a daily basis and wanted a group of people around him that could share his understanding of what the military is up to on a daily basis. And anyways, to answer the question of how we could all be guilty of journalism, I was in some small way contemplating what we saw here, that there is a very low amount of trust in U.S. media institutions right now. There are people who don't believe that they will protect sources. There are also people who don't think that a lot of these main, I call them prestige media organizations, are going to do anything more but turn around to U.S. security agencies or the government and do their bidding. So they don't probably want to go to them with information. So what would happen if you had a friend or a family member who was in a military branch of the government? What would you have happen if there was a friend or a family member, someone you knew, who was in one of these security agencies? Maybe they work for a security contractor. What would happen if they came to you and said, I really think this should be published. I can't publish it myself, but here's this document, and could you go post it on your Twitter? Could you go put it on reddit.com, or could you put it on your Facebook, or could you just let people know I need this to start gaining some traction, and I want people to know what I'm seeing here. I object to it, but I can't put it out myself. It would be too risky. I'm reasonably certain it won't be traced back to me, but I would like you. Well, I can tell you immediately that the Justice Department, with the help of the FBI, will be trying to investigate where that document came from. Let's just pretend it's something like, oh, it's a new mass surveillance program, or it says they have new power that they've claimed to wage war overseas that we didn't know they were claiming they had. And now you started a conversation about something that we didn't have a democratic discussion about. And I guarantee you, they're going to be tracking people down. They're going to probably come to you. They're going to know where you got that document. But technically speaking, you've engaged in journalism by publishing. You've done exactly what WikiLeaks did in a very, 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 very small sense. It's just one document. Mind you, WikiLeaks was dealing in hundreds of thousands, if not millions of documents. But you performed a tiny act of journalism by putting that document out there to your little group of people. And in doing that, the government wants to know, where is this leak coming from? And you could be guilty of journalism. They could come after you.
Well, I've done a little bit of research on this current case that you're discussing. And, well, the irony is, for one thing, most of the information that those documents reveal, for those of us paying any attention, we already kind of knew that stuff. I think the only shocking revelation is that, for example, Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin, who clearly must have known the information, for example, that's, within the Pentagon and so forth. I mean, they know. I'm just referring to the war in Ukraine currently. They already knew that war. There's no way Ukraine can win that war. Yet he would still go out as recently as last week proclaiming that Ukraine just, has got the big spring offensive coming, and that we just need to give them more weapons. So that's really the irony of that. But the other great shock to me is the fact that this organization, Bellingcat, I'm sure you're familiar with who they are. They basically tracked this guy down and handed him over, which, and then, and it just sort of demonstrates what you're saying, that, the quote legacy media surely must understand that if Julian gets convicted, they're all basically guilty of journalism, correct?
I think that they do have some awareness, but they're also in denial. They also believe that the Justice Department isn't talking about them when they describe the actions of Julian Assange. They believe that's and the Justice Department has treated it in this way. They've tried to say, this is a unique case. We are not endangering press freedom, as all these global organizations have claimed. I need to be very clear in this conversation with you that you can't really find any reputable human rights, civil liberties, or press freedom organization that hasn't condemned and said in some way or another that they believe these charges should be dropped. And so what they've done is they've tried to treat this like an exception to the rule. And as I go into detail in the book, there are ways in which they present and cast Julian Assange so that we are deluded into believing he is not a journalist, so that we come to see him as something that is more like a hacker or someone who maybe behaves in an anarchist manner. Not to say that there's anything wrong with that as an ideology, but obviously built into the United States history and global history, anarchist is to mean someone who doesn't obey the laws. Anarchist is to mean somebody who doesn't see value in social order. And so they come up with these ways to get you to believe that Julian Assange is not somebody who you should support, in order to make it easier for them to bring these unprecedented charges. I stress that we have never seen an Espionage Act case like this. Typically, they would go for people who had access to the information, who had the ability to, they had a security clearance. Jack Teixeira, as we mentioned, we can use him as an example. He had a security clearance. He signed a non-disclosure agreement. He made a vow, whether we have sympathy for what he did or not. He, Chelsea Manning, Edward Snowden, they all signed documents that said, I'm not going to disclose this to people who are not authorized to receive it. That's a dilemma we have to grapple with as we pursue the truth. Julian Assange has no issue with any of this. None of this is anything he has to worry about when he performs the role of editor-in-chief of WikiLeaks. So he should be free, just like you and me, to discuss and publish and share these documents and not be kept in prison as he is right now.
Well, if it, at very least, the prosecution of him, and it's so, I mean, as I said at the beginning of the show, I mean, this is the 4th anniversary of him being locked up in Belmarsh prison, which is the harshest. I understand it's a very horrible situation that he's in, being locked away for 20 hours a day, very limited visiting rights, not much ability to communicate, or if any at all. Certainly it has, if nothing else, it's having a chilling effect on people who would otherwise engage in the same kind of activity, including legacy media. On page 50, you say, what if the New York Times were substituted for WikiLeaks? Maybe expand on that note.
So that's actually, I think you're referring to a quote that came from Chelsea Manning's court-martial.
Yeah.
And so I refer back to this moment that was stunning for everyone tuning in, the few reporters that were there, the activists who were supporting Chelsea, who were there at Fort Meade in Maryland, and were tuning into how the U.S. military was prosecuting the source of these documents that Julian Assange is now being punished for publishing on the WikiLeaks website. And Judge Colonel Denise Lind, she's an Army colonel, did ask the military prosecutor, one of them directly, if the New York Times was substituted for WikiLeaks. So if you were prosecuting, if Chelsea Manning had given the documents to New York Times, mm-hmm. would you still be pursuing this case the same? And they said yes, without hesitating, which tells you two things. One, it's actually good for Julian Assange because it means that the military prosecutors recognized that there is no meaningful difference between WikiLeaks and New York Times, and that they are both media organizations. At least, maybe they don't have the same culture. I agree with that there's a very big difference between the way the New York Times would choose to operate versus how WikiLeaks would operate. And I think when we're talking about the New York Times, that might be to a fault. But the other thing is that this is damaging. This is dangerous. This is a new way of thinking. This is basically saying that they would go after the sources of the New York Times the way that they went after sources of information that gave documents to WikiLeaks. But it's also saying that they would be willing to accuse the sources who gave information to New York Times of aiding the enemy. As I detail in the book, the military prosecutors came up with this charge that was very convoluted, but could have been a horrific precedent that would have had huge ramifications for press freedom. And this is before we were talking, this is like 10 years before we're talking about this Julian Assange case now, and essentially saying that because she gave documents to WikiLeaks, she had indirectly aided and abetted Al-Qaeda terrorists.
You're referring to Chelsea Manning, of course.
To Chelsea Manning. I'm not referring to Julian Assange, although obviously Julian Assange and his associates have been accused of things that make them seem like they have fed terrorists that have been, opposed to the United States, who have been in wars with the United States, because they, said things about war documents from Afghanistan and Iraq. I'm referring to Chelsea and how they decided that they were going to bring in Osama bin Laden and suggest that she somehow, in publishing this information, had aided terrorism. And that fell flat. Fortunately, the judge did not see that there was any merit to that argument, but they tried to do this, and they would have tried to do this, they claimed, whether we were talking about New York Times or WikiLeaks.
Well, after reading your book, most of the case against Julian defies logic, on a basic sort of legalistic basis.
Yes.
That's the irony of the whole thing. We have to go to a quick community break for about a minute or so. So we'll do that, and then when we come back in, I've got so many things to ask you, but I want to also make sure that we have time for some of the music that you've put together. So, how about we when we come back, I'll get you to preview the next track, and we'll play that, and then we'll go back to the conversation. So, stay tuned. We'll be right back with Kevin Gosztola here on The Long Way Round.
Hello, I'm a Marine. It took me a long time to make this call.
My buddies from the Army are all gone now.
I feel so stuck.
If you or a veteran in your life is experiencing thoughts of suicide, dial 988, then press 1 to reach the Veterans Crisis Line.
Hello, I'm Lindsay Walkowitz from O Positive Radio Hour, Tuesday nights at 8 here on Radio Kingston. Every October during the O Positive Festival, We exchange the art of medicine for the medicine of art. And the O Positive Radio Hour is one of the ways that we keep that mission and exchange alive all year long. Every week, we feature themes around art, music, and wellness.
With me, Sean Harrison.
And me, Jesse Shearer.
And me, Joe Conqueror.
And me, Amy Gardner.
And me, Lindsay.
And me, Lara Hope.
We speak with creative people, feature the voices and work of O Positive alumni artists, musicians, and providers, and get insights from experts in all fields. Plus, we play incredible music from our festival performers during every show. That's the O Positive Radio Hour, every Tuesday night at 8, right here on Radio Kingston, AM 1490, FM 1079, and anytime at radiokingston.org.
And the Senate House State Historic Site is officially opening for the 2023-24 season, Wednesday, April the 19th. Beginning on the 19th, Senate House will be open Wednesdays through Saturdays from 10 a.m. to 5 p.m. and Sundays from 1 p.m. to 5 p.m. through October 31st. On Thursday, April 20th, Senate House will commemorate the ratification of the 1777 New York State Constitution with quill pen writing, guided tours, and gifting free printed copies of the original state constitution to visitors. At 5:30 p.m., there will be a brief talk from historic site manager Aaron Robinson, creating a new government for New York, the road to Senate House, and the 1777 Constitution. Senate House opening and Constitution Day, Wednesday, April 19th, and Thursday, April 20th, beginning at 10 a.m. at Senate House State Historic Site, 296 Fair Street in Kingston. For more information, find Senate House State Historic Site on Facebook. Welcome back, Kevin. How are you doing?
Still good to be with you.
The next track on your playlist that you'd suggested is a track by PJ Harvey, one of my favorites. The track is called Let England Shake. What drew you to that song and to add it to the playlist?
Yeah, so the tracks that we're featuring tonight are all in one way or another in my book. Before we start the chapters, I picked some words and I selected artists that at some point or another, maybe they're not that outspoken today, but have thrown their support behind Julian Assange. And PJ Harvey had an opportunity to host a 3-hour show on BBC's Radio 4, and she had 3 hours of time, and she brought Julian Assange on in 2014. And at that time, she had already put out this big album, Let England Shake. Mm-hmm. So I use a different song in the book, but I picked this one because I think it fits the show and what we're doing. And I also like the tone of it. The words don't maybe stand out as I had other lyrics for another song I picked on Battleship Hill. But this song, Let England Shake, I think is really good because it speaks to the despondency and I think the malaise that exists in Britain and the conditions that have led to Brexit and all of the problems with institutions in the UK. I think what you're seeing, the decaying institutions, those are the same ones that have allowed this extradition to be authorized to the United States. And that's what PJ Harvey. So when you listen to her, I want you to think about the way in which institutions that should protect the rule of law have failed Julian Assange.
Mm-hmm. This is PJ Harvey with Let England Shake.
Rise again.
PJ Harvey, Let England Shake. She's one of my favorite artists. She's always done such incredible work, but the fact that she's willing to stand up for Julian is even more impressive, I gotta say. Kevin, I was, I'm going to refer back to your discussion earlier today with Dan Ellsberg, and that may be one of the. I mean, who knows? But he made reference several times to the fact that he doesn't have a lot of time left, and one of the things that really struck me was when he said that one of his deepest regrets was that he didn't expose his knowledge of the realities on the ground in Vietnam sooner. I think he was talking about back in 1961, and he sort of said, had I perhaps come forward, who knows how many hundreds and thousands or even millions of lives might have not been lost in that conflict. And I've read Bright Shining Lie by Neil Sheehan, which is an incredible book. And it really does sort of remind you the absolutely important value of whistleblowers. What a world it would be if we didn't have people that were brave enough to come out and say what they see. It's just and Julian, obviously, I would say is probably the most important journalist of certainly the last 50 years, in my opinion. It's not a question, but I don't know if you want to pick up on that statement.
I think that both Dan and Julian have this way of understanding how to boil all of this down into simple declarations that you can get behind. So to listen to Dan Ellsberg speak, who, has been very generous to me. He endorsed the book.
Yeah.
He gave me this time to speak with him. He had, at that time when I recorded that conversation, it was at the it was the first few days of March. He just was circulating this message among his friends and colleagues to let them know that he had been diagnosed with cancer.
Mm-hmm.
But he was very confident. And I don't want to say this might not be Dan Ellsberg's view, but this was my opinion. It was, worried about the future of the world, but I think he was at peace with his diagnosis, and that it gave him a clarified understanding of what he needed to do next as a human being. And knowing that he just has a few months, he was going to take full advantage of that to talk to as many people as he could, and to engage in interviews and to share what wisdom he has, and to do just that much more to speak against the threat of nuclear warfare in the world, which he has committed his life to, and to also speak up about war and the ways in which we get embroiled into open-ended conflicts. And so he said to me, we just have a small chance. We really just have a small chance. But I mean, I know from Dan, I know from figures like the late great people's historian Howard Zinn that we always need to rely on small acts of people in order to find some way to move forward and chip away at these struggles. And then Julian Assange recognized, as he stepped out in an anti-war rally in, I believe it was Trafalgar Square in London. It was an anniversary. I think it was an Afghanistan war anniversary of that invasion, the beginning of it. And he said something about peace, and basically said that if wars can be started by lies, then peace can be started by truth. And I think that's a very powerful statement. And it's very simple. And in the way that Dan Ellsberg would talk in simple terms about peace and war, I think that's a very simple way of boiling down the motivation for why he was willing to publish those documents, because he's willing to take a stand for this cause of peace, and in a way that you might have editors at the New York Times or Washington Post, or you might have a producer at CNN decide that they need to get on the phone and have a conversation with people at the White House before they publish information. Julian Assange is not going to warn people that he's about to tell everyone globally what the U.S. military is doing, who's dying, knowing history going all the way back to Vietnam, and knowing the way in which the Iraq War was started. And we just marked the 20th anniversary of that invasion and occupation. He went forward and he made all of this material available, full databases. The full database of Iraq material has been studied forensically. There is a group in the UK called Iraq Body Count that has done some tremendous work bettering our understanding of the war. And that's just one small example of what being fearless has afforded us, and standing on these principles, being willing to fight this. I'll emphasize that he has a family, and he's in Belmarsh prison, and he's not been able to be with his 2 children and his wife, who he married in prison, who he met while he was in the Ecuador embassy. But still, he believes in these principles. He believes in these causes, and he keeps on struggling.
Have you ever met or spoken with Julian? I assume you have.
No, I haven't.
Oh, you have
haven't.
not?
No,
Okay.
but I had the honor to meet his wife, Stella. I was
yeah.
able to. I got it, and she's doing tremendous work.
Well, she's kind of picking up carrying the torch for him, really, in many ways.
Being this gigantic advocate that you need to be. And I've covered several, just to be clear here, Julian is not a whistleblower, but I must bring into the universe of understanding where people find their courage, that I've had the fortune of covering several whistleblower cases and seeing what family members do as they are dealing with the government prosecuting them, particularly under the Espionage Act. And some will rise to the moment and speak out, and others will run away and be understandably fearful and cautious and timid. But Stella knows that she has to be out there, and she's made a big thing of it, and it's important for her to be out there. And then I note in my book others who have stepped forward, and so I think that what Stella's doing, you now have this movie that has gone around called Ithaca, with John and Gabriel, who Gabriel's Julian Assange's brother, John Shipton is Julian Assange's father, but they've toured to show the ways in which they're toiling to try and free Julian, and trying to mobilize people in Europe and Australia and Latin America and all other parts of the world. And then here in the US, they're touring right now, and they're doing it at a time when, we might be slowly breaking through. We had a letter that came out from 5 members of Congress last week that was put together by Representative Rashida Tlaib, asking the Justice Department to drop the charges. And that was a huge deal. That took a lot of work. The organization that helped make that possible is called Defending Rights and Dissent in D.C. My friend and colleague Chip Gibbons was lobbying Congress members. It was very difficult. There's actually 7 people. I don't want to undercut the work that they did, because it was really difficult. The politics around this are suffocating. There's a lot of people who I think they need to be reminded of the values that they should be supporting, because their self-interest is it gets in the way, and they're unwilling to add their name to this, and they're fearful of associations. Republicans are fearful of associating with certain Democrats. Democrats are fearful of associating with certain Republicans, and so that means that it's difficult for Julian Assange to get support built in the Congress for dropping these charges, even though I think there might be more people willing to question this case than you would see on a daily basis.
Mm-hmm. Kevin, we got to go to a couple more community announcements. And then when we come back, I thought we could play the Roger Waters track, and I'll get you to preamble that. So stay tuned. We'll be right back after these massages.
Hi, I'm Devin Wood, Community Outreach Coordinator with the Kingston Emergency Food Collaborative, KEFC. KEFC is a coalition of individuals and community organizations that came together in March 2020 at the start of the pandemic to ensure that people in our community had nutritious food. KEFC continues to provide food and is also working to achieve food sovereignty for all. We have working groups to realize this goal: communications, direct service, education and outreach, production and procurement, and systems change. And we are strengthening the coalition by inviting individuals and organizations that are already involved in this type of work or want to become involved to join us. To join the KEFC coalition, email kingstonemergencyfood@gmail. To learn more, visit kingstonemergencyfood.com. And if you or someone you know needs food, call 888-316-0879.
Radio Kingston. Many voices.
Many voices.
Many voices. One community.
Hi, everybody. Warren in the Morning here. Join me every Monday through Friday from 6 a.m. till 10 a.m. as we begin the day together right here on Radio Kingston. I've got the best music, trivia contests, local and national news, Dan along with the latest sports, and many surprise guests as well to keep you informed and entertained. See you every weekday morning starting at 6 right here on AM 1490, FM 107.9, and anytime at radiokingston.org.
You're listening to The Long Way Round here on Radio Kingston. My name's Malcolm Byrne. Kevin, I had Roger Waters on the show last year. I think it was last May. And the last time I saw him, in fact, was in New York City at the annual rally in front of the British consulate down there on 2nd or 3rd Avenue. So Roger has been for a long time a very outspoken supporter and advocate for Julian. So perhaps you could preamble the track that we're going to play and why you chose that one for this occasion.
Yeah. So as you're saying, I had to include a song from Roger because he's probably the most prominent musician who has supported Julian Assange and used his tour that he went on in the United States, and now he's in Europe.
Trying to get to play. He's trying to get to play in Germany right now. He's got
to win a court case to play in Frankfurt. And anyways, so I got to see the show, and
pretty incredible.
The moment when it was a fabulous show, and at one certain point, he plays the Collateral Murder video. Mm-hmm. Which is the name of the video that WikiLeaks gave to the 2007 Apache helicopter attack in Baghdad that was captured. The footage Chelsea Manning gave to WikiLeaks to publish, you see, to Reuters employees.
I think I might have lost you, Kevin.
And
you're connected.
So he plays this video, and he knows the audience doesn't know who.
Kevin, I've lost your signal. You may have to sign out and sign in again, but I will go to the track while we're doing that. So this is Roger Waters with "Is This
Julian
the Life?"
Assange probably doesn't even know about Chelsea Rock show. He educates them. Can you hear me?
Oh yeah,
hello?
Yeah, you're back. Sorry, I'll go ahead and play the song. Perhaps sign out and sign in again.
Hey.
Yeah.
Story after story after story is bad. I won. And the other thing, chaos. There's zero chaos. We are running. This is a fine-tuned machine.
Football stars, men in bars, it's true that ants don't have enough IQ to differentiate between the pain that other people feel and, well, for instance, cutting leaves or crawling across windowsills in search of open treacle tins. So like the ants, are we just dumb? Is that why we don't feel or see? Or are we all just numbed out on reality TV? So every time the curtain falls, every time the curtain falls on some forgotten life, it is because we all stood by, silent and indifferent.
Clearly, Roger meant the crossfade to go into the next song, which is why that song doesn't really have an ending. But are you there, Kevin?
Yeah. You hear me now?
Yes, much better. One of the things that struck me seeing Roger's show was the passion and also the emotion. You know, when that collateral murder video came up on the screen, God Almighty! And then when he did the thing where he shows each of our successive U.S., as he referred to nitwit. What in the song he refers to each president as a nitwit or something like that. But
yeah,
each time, you know, he's got Clinton and he's war criminal, and then there's Bush war criminal, and Obama war criminal, and Trump war criminal, and Biden, and it's just one after the other. Boy, such a great show. But anyway, I digress. I wanted to ask.
It's a fine digression, though.
Well, the fact of the matter is he and myself, and I'm sure you feel the same way. I don't feel guided by anything other than a great sense of passion for justice in what I'm doing. I don't know if you feel the same way, but that's really the motivating force for me, is to just try and correct, even if, as Daniel said, even if just some small way we make some little change, at least we can say we tried, you know?
And that's my motivation too, at least with the journalism that I do through my media organization, and I guess particularly when I'm writing about whistleblowers, journalists that get arrested, thrown in jail, as Roger was singing about in that song, or leaks, or the actions of the national security state. I don't concern myself with what different clubs or tribes or groups or political parties are doing. I don't really see one as I don't identify with one more than the other. I have I'd say I almost have an equal number of issues with both, and I also don't think that really helps get to the heart of the conversation that needs to be had. So I am an issues-based person. I try to focus on what is really happening. When I say that I am focused on systemic abuses of power, I really mean that I'm interested in the very things that, you know, animated Julian Assange and WikiLeaks, that they're motivated in what's driving governments to adopt surveillance systems, what's driving governments to revolutionize their warfare systems, what's behind this, things that go beyond are even more pressing than the next election, that are issues that linger with us. And I think that's where we start to get to the core of Julian Assange's case, because what is really revealed by the Justice Department pursuing this case is the fact that they can be very broad, but the certain people in government saw Julian as a threat and needed to neutralize him in some manner through this case, because as we've seen in some smaller way, it's not WikiLeaks sized leaks, but just what we've seen with Jack Teixeira over the last 2 or 3 weeks. When they don't know where the leaks are coming from, when they don't know where the information is coming from, when they're worried that those documents are going to be read by people, when the news media is actually covering those and not attacking the messenger, then they're afraid because it means that it might be harder for them to sell us a war.
Well, speaking of the way the media portrays things, I mean, what's shocking to me really is the narrative in the sense of how our mainstream media, rather than focusing, I'm referring specifically to Jack Teixeira and this recent occurrence, instead of focusing on the information that has been revealed, they're focusing on the guy, his personality. They're attacking him as a person. They're saying, oh, he's a right-wing conspiracy theorist. He's a gun nut. All these, next thing you know, we'll find out he's a pedophile. But instead of discussing what the leaks reveal, yeah, and it's the same thing they did with Julian when, the whole sex, the rape thing came up. And so, I mean, for example, I had a conversation. I was actually reading your book. This was about 2 weeks ago. I was in a situation where I was working with a few other people, and we had some, time in between the work, and I was sitting reading your book, and the guy next to me, a nice older gentleman, said, "Oh, I don't know about that guy." He was a very negative comment, and I didn't. It's no point in getting into arguments with people because no matter what you say, half the time it doesn't matter. But because they've been sort of systematically brainwashed by the media, but even to this day, there's this lingering sense in the general public's mind that Julian kind of is getting what he deserves so much. And that's really kind of depressing when you think about it. I wanted to ask you what brought you to Julian in the first place. Well, you've been on this almost 10-year mission, which has kind of culminated with this publishing of the book. Where did you first get started, and how did you get interested in his case?
Yeah, I'll start with a few details, and then depending on what time we have, you can press me for some more additional details. But the thumbnail summary is basically that I am not a professional journalist. Well, I am a professional journalist now, but I wasn't trained to be. I didn't go to school.
Good like me,
for
actually.
Journalism. I was someone who wanted to make movies, and I went to school at a place in Chicago called Columbia College, and learned and was interested in documentary production. So there was some affinity with journalism there. But I was also writing and covering anti-war demonstrations in Chicago, and I was doing my own work and sharing my own commentary and analysis that gained me some traction. And I had an opportunity to be an intern at The Nation magazine for 6 months. And through that experience, one of the things that I did was report on these diplomatic cables that WikiLeaks was publishing. And it was scoop after scoop. People who didn't live through this will never understand what it was like, but to be there in that moment and see how the government was on edge about what we were going to learn about next from these files and the impact it was having country to country. There were, we had to remember, there were entire regimes that were in turmoil because of the information that was being revealed, particularly in Egypt and Tunisia. And that became identified as the colloquial term that the human rights organizations gave to it was the Arab Spring. But there were also other revelations that were ricocheting around people's governments. And I was doing my own reporting. I was revealing new information. I was covering documents that weren't being reported on and trying in my own small way to give those some air. And those were being shared widely. And I just decided that having benefited from this, seeing that people were coming to my work because I was publishing this information that, rather than go to the FBI and help them pursue Chelsea Manning or pursue sources or encourage them to hunt down the leaker, rather than writing op-eds about how Chelsea did whistleblowing the wrong way or whatever, I cared for the choices that she had made and the sacrifice that she made and wanted to follow her court-martial in its entirety to tell the story, to bear witness to how she was being prosecuted. And then from that point forward, I decided to continue to follow this war on whistleblowers, as it had been generally called by many of these human rights and press freedom groups that do this work. And from that point onward, I couldn't look back. I mean, this was what I became an authority in covering, and I owed it to these people because there's just not a lot of journalists out there who cover this as a regular beat. And you could say that for a lot of issues. It's not the only thing that gets undercovered. There's a ton of issues out there that need more coverage. But this was one of the ones where I was able to have, as we keep going back to Dan Ellsberg, that small little impact, knowing that what I was doing was gaining some traction.
Well, one of my favorite quotes was the actor Mickey Rooney once was asked what he wanted written on his headstone when he passed away, and he said, "Oh, just write, I tried." So that's all we can do, just we all collectively do our bit. I mean, this whole issue of what we call a surveillance state, that's really the pressing issue of our time, I think. Would you not agree?
Absolutely. I think it is. And it's actually wrapped up in Julian Assange's case, because we see surveillance not only in the fact that a small part of the case, as you'll know from the book, is WikiLeaks stepping out to help Edward Snowden to safety when he was in Hong Kong,
right,
and sending one of their editors, Sarah Harrison, to be with him on an airplane. And eventually, we know he was stuck in Moscow and exiled effectively because the State Department revoked his passport, depriving him of the ability to get to Ecuador. And so there's that, and he was exposing NSA surveillance programs. And then we see the surveillance that has been directed at Julian Assange. And this was, so back in March, I went to Berlin for a conference, and that's when I got to meet Stella, and I was on a panel, and we discussed the targeted surveillance of Julian Assange for a group of people. And we see these allegations that, if you can say that Julian Assange's case hasn't gotten enough press, then the next thing is that in the United States, it's gotten little to no press attention that the CIA waged this campaign against Julian Assange while he was in the Ecuador embassy under Mike Pompeo, who I understand has just said he will not be running for president of the United States.
I think the Inuit in Canada can breathe a sigh of relief, because apparently he declared that that whole territory up there really should be part of the United States. I was like,
yeah,
boy, oh boy, I wouldn't want to be an Inuit person.
So I don't know what he's going to be doing with his time, but I'm glad it's not campaigning to be president based on what we've seen him do. He was zealous and unhinged, and he had no restraint when it came to going after WikiLeaks. And we also have learned about this private security company, UC Global, that we suspect was working with the CIA. And there's still a lot to be confirmed, but the basic details that we have point to that surveillance issue that you're talking about, because, we see someone who is treated like a wanted fugitive because they seek asylum, and the government of the United States allowed all manner of activity, and the security services were going after Julian and his family and trying to figure out if certain children who were brought into the embassy were Julian Assange's babies or not, and
Well, they
trying to come up with ways. What?
They were, I mean, they were spying on him the whole time. I mean, they had set up cameras inside his accommodations there. They were monitoring his phone calls. I mean, there was nothing he could do without being monitored. And I think that speaks to the larger issue. I was listening to something or other today. It was a piece about the Jeffrey Epstein case as it relates to the head of J.P. Morgan, Jamie Dimon. And one of the points that came up was the whole point of this ever-increasing surveillance state is because I think them, I know it's a weird they, but the power structure understands that the public is becoming increasingly aware of the circumstances and the predicament that they're being thrown into, and so that these mechanisms are being put into place in order to put down the revolution before it starts. You see. I know it probably sounds a little conspiratorial to some people, but I really think that's true, and I think that's another sort of imperative of the surveillance state or the cold, what they call the deep state to really go after Julian is to sort of go after the whole idea of this thing that can't be controlled, as you say. People have to sort of function in the dark almost, but I wanted to ask you something because you mentioned UC Global. What is Vault 7? I've always kind of wondered what is that? What were those documents in relation to?
Yeah, so this was hundreds. There were many documents that they were able to get their hands on. It's considered possibly the biggest leak of CIA information in U.S. history. At least that's how WikiLeaks billed it. And the contents were essentially details of the cyber warfare arsenal that the CIA has available to them. And so there were activities or capabilities that WikiLeaks ended up detailing on their website and received some widespread attention. Things like the ability of the CIA to use Samsung televisions to hack into them, to be able to listen to you through your Samsung television. The way that they another thing was WhatsApp and Signal, these encrypted messaging services, how they could compromise them. They relied on something called zero-day exploits. I'm not the most tech-savvy person, but basically what that means is that there are ways that they can hack into the software. And usually, Apple figures these out and they patch them up. That's when you update your phone, you are patching your security vulnerabilities that have been identified. But the CIA would know about these vulnerabilities and they wouldn't tell the tech companies because they were going to use them to further their surveillance or their offensive warfare, whatever they were doing. And so we learn all about these different things that the CIA was capable of doing. It was hugely embarrassing to the CIA because, as we learned, Mike Pompeo and others, they were prideful. WikiLeaks hadn't happened to the CIA. WikiLeaks had happened to the Pentagon. WikiLeaks had happened to the State Department, and they really believed they were not going to be one that would have to deal with a massive leak. And then from that point on, it's my view that this thirst for vengeance, as you hear Mike Pompeo talking about WikiLeaks in his first speech as CIA director, he's motivated to go after and target Julian Assange.
Yeah, it almost seems like it's a personal vendetta with Pompeo. Lord knows why. There's an irony to Julian's case in the sense that, well, first of all, you have countries. You mentioned WhatsApp, but I was thinking about the fact that there's there seems to be a movement to sort of discredit and shut down TikTok in this kind, because it's, the Chinese are using it to gather all kinds of information on us and blah. But, when people say, well, geez, it's, good job we don't live in China, given their apparent human rights record. But all of these countries are going to look at the United States and say, well, this is a bit like the pot calling the kettle black. As long as Julian is locked up in Belmarsh, and especially if he gets extradited, we don't have a leg to stand on, really, when it comes down to it in terms of, that.
Yeah.
And it also seems, from a psychological analysis, there's a lot of projection going on, we're accusing people, and it's like, no, actually, you're projecting onto others what you're really doing, what the surveillance state is doing itself, So I don't know. It's a.
Well, I think of the, if I could just quickly add here, I think of
of course,
the case of the Wall Street Journal reporter who has been arrested in Russia.
Right.
And it presents quite a conundrum for the U.S. government. And I don't find myself having to twist and turn and justify my position because I've been principled. So I can support saying that Russia should free Evan Gershkovich and that Julian Assange should also be freed from jail as well. But when you listen to the Biden White House, they do have an inconsistency that they have to deal with because, look, Russia has accused this Wall Street Journal reporter of collecting state secrets. That's exactly what they say Julian Assange was doing.
Mm-hmm.
So what is it? Is it a crime to perform journalism during a war? Because that's what Evan Gershkovich was doing. Allegedly was trying to report on what weapons So I read something that these weapons manufacturers in Russia, he wanted to go to their factories and interview people and figure out if there were any people dissenting against Russia's involvement in, that do support the unfolding conflict, and see if he could find anybody who didn't support the war. And so do you think that journalism is to be supported, or is it a crime? And the fact is that if it's not a crime, what Evan Gershkovich did, then Julian Assange should be free.
Absolutely.
If it's a crime, what Julian Assange did, then unfortunately, Russia gets to keep Evan Gershkovich in jail because you can't have it both ways.
Well, try telling that to the nincompoops in the White House. I'm somewhat ambivalent towards Vladimir Putin. I'm sure he's not I probably wouldn't want to hang out with the guy. I view him as someone who's very, very intelligent, pretty astute. Whether he's an evil man or not, that invading another country, it's illegal. So there you go. But in his most recent speech that he made on the 21st of February to the Kremlin, or the Duma, I should say, one of the things that he said in his speech, and I thought it was very important, is he said one of the worst things a person or a country can do is to consider itself exceptional. And I thought about that, and I thought, well, that's the excuse that this country uses all the time. And that would be the counterfactual to what you were just saying. We can persecute Julian Assange, but the American journalist in Russia, well, that's a different thing because America's different. We're exceptional. We don't even sign up. I don't even think the United States has signed up to the ICC, International Criminal Court, so it doesn't recognize that court officially, yet it constantly expects to put on trial people like Slobodan Milosevic and, various despotic, ironic. I'm saying this in ironic terms, despotic African leaders and so forth. Yet, nonetheless, so I don't know if you want to comment on that.
Yeah, no, it's not really like I resist these good and evil terminologies that get bandied about because we have a government that labels certain countries as enemies. I don't know, and this is sort of the freedom of thought that I have not growing up during the Cold War, not growing up as somebody who's been taught to hate the Soviet Union or taught to despise China. And it was my own viewpoint that we should invite this multipolar world that we're seeing. And that's sort of what is at stake here with Julian Assange's case. But I think one of the reasons why he's been attacked so much is he didn't identify with the United States. He said, I'm going to be a global actor. And I don't necessarily agree with what the Chinese government is doing. I don't necessarily agree with what the Russian government is doing in many instances. But I'm not going to pick one country, one superpower over the other and make sure that all the journalism that I perform is such that benefits the United States solely, or I'm not going to worry that if I publish this material it might help Russia challenge the United States, or it might help China challenge the United States. I think that's a big deal. So I don't have this issue with China growing as a regional power. And I don't have any memory of the Soviet Union. I don't have any memory of Russia. So as far as this conflict goes, my only analog is the Iraq War. And if Russia's to be condemned for a preemptive invasion, which I think that's fair, then you have to look at the Iraq War and occupation as an almost carbon, copy of the U.S. believing they needed to seize territory and control it. And look at the devastation that was wrought by that. So, rather than focus on these personalities, which is what we do with what we see the media do with Julian Assange, what we see them do with Vladimir Putin, I think you do too. We look at these actions, we look at these conflicts, we look at the things that we see unfold, and we have to question what we're being told about all of them.
Well, not to delve too deeply, because I have one last question. I know you have to go in about 8 minutes, so I want to get to that quickly. But I will say one thing, and this was a conversation I had with Chris Hedges a couple of months ago, in regards to Iraq, United States versus, say, Russia, Ukraine. There's a big difference, when you think about the fact that the area that Russia now occupies has much more. There's much more. There's an 9-year-old civil war going on in that region, with ethnic Russians who really do identify more as Russians than Ukrainians. So at least there's some pretext for that, as opposed to poor old what's his name, Colin Powell, holding up this imaginary vial of white powder and saying, we know for sure this guy has weapons masters. There's no validity to those claims whatsoever, so, but anyway, that's just my own opinion. Before you go, I because for the last half hour, I'll play some more of the music from your playlist, but I wanted to ask you, what do you think the future holds for Julian? Where do you think things are going to go, and in the next 6 months to a year or whatever for him?
So
if you had a crystal ball,
Yeah, so let me just let me give you the worst case, and then let me end on a more optimistic note. My fear and my gut instinct suggests to me that the Biden White House is very comfortable with Julian Assange languishing in a jail cell in Belmarsh, and they couldn't be more pleased with how this is drawn out and does not have an end in sight. They're happy that he's fighting an appeal process in the UK and that it could take until 2025 or 2026 before it's exhausted entirely. And then there's a chance that he would be put on a plane and brought to the U.S. for trial.
Where he would definitely not survive that. That's for sure.
I thought it's distinctly possible that at that time they might abandon it because they don't really want to put him on trial. And at that point, think about it, it would have been 7 years since he was arrested. And that's probably longer than whatever sentence he would receive in prison. That's just my informed opinion, having covered Espionage Act cases, and the sort of sentence that gets handed down if you're convicted. I know people have said he could go to jail or prison for up to 175 years maximum sentence, but it doesn't usually work out like that you would get that much of a sentence. But 7 years right now, I mean, he's in his mid-50s. He had a mini stroke. His health is constantly declining. As you say, he might not survive. The optimistic note to end on is I had a reader who bought a copy of my book, who was reading it, and she said her kid asked her about the book, and she was telling her about the story of Julian, and she said to her, what happens in the end? And she wanted so bad to tell her that Julian Assange would be free. And I said to her in my exchange that, I might get a chance to do a second or a third edition of this book. And I really do hope that I can write an ending to the book that describes how we were able to free Julian Assange from Belmarsh prison and also to free him from this prosecution. And so the optimism is that there is good political organizing happening. There are politicians more than ever who are speaking out. We had 4 letters last week: UK parliamentarians, Australian parliamentarians, Mexico parliamentarians, Brazilian parliamentarians who came out in protest. And people are doing grassroots work that is fundamental to getting to a point where this case is no longer possible to be pursued. And I think people have to just keep chipping away.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, we're doing our best here at Radio Kingston. At least I am anyways. Yeah, it's a fantastic book. I'm going to plug it one more time. The book by Kevin Gosztola is called Guilty of Journalism, The Political Case Against Julian Assange. And I highly recommend it. It's got a couple of great plugs. Daniel Ellsberg writes, Kevin Gosztola is a rare journalist who understands the abominable threat that the case against Assange poses to press freedom. I rely on his indispensable reporting, not only to stay informed about Assange, but also to follow developments in the wider war on whistleblowers. What better endorsement could you get than that, I suppose? Kevin, it's been fantastic. Thank you so much for agreeing to be on the program. I wish you all the best, and I hope that we can talk again in the near future. Before you go, the next track on your list is a track by Brian Eno called There Were Bells. Do you perhaps want to give us a preview of that before, or preview of that before we say goodbye and bring that song on?
Yeah, so Brian is obviously an acclaimed artist, but also a big supporter of Julian Assange's. And I understand that he did the music for the Ithaca documentary that follows John Shipton and his son, Gabriel, as they go around trying to free Julian. And so, yeah, I picked this. This is from his latest album of work, which is very reflective and ponders the state of humanity. in ways that are not, these aren't direct protest songs, but that he's speaking to some of the bleakness and interrogating things that are really heavy in our world.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Kevin. I wish you all the best, and thank you so much for joining me. And I wish you every. Oh, and by the way, your shadowproof is that shadowproof.com? People can go and find your work.
Yeah. Just very quickly, I know you got to get to the song, but shadowproof.com is my website. My newsletter is at thedissenter.org, thedissenter.org, which is where people can stay up to date on Julian's case.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much. Be well and stay safe, and we'll talk to you next time. Thank you.
Thank you.
This is Brian Eno. There Were Bells.
From our studio in Midtown, this is Radio Kingston, WKNY, AM 1490, FM 1079, Kingston, New York.
What does community radio mean to you?
Folks can communicate with each other, different people from different backgrounds, different walks of life, share their opinions and not be judged about what they think and how they feel. This is an amazing opportunity for people to just be themselves collectively, and that's what truly makes community.
Radio Kingston.
Many voices, one community.
Hi, I'm Rory Kane, captain of the sloop Clearwater, an educational sailboat on the Hudson River. We take school groups out on the water for hands-on learning and experiential education, and we depend on our volunteers to help with sloop operations. Every week, from April to October, 4 volunteers come and live on board with us and help facilitate our sailing classroom program and contribute to our onboard community. If you volunteer with us, you'll get to participate as an onboard educator telling people about the sloop, and you'll also get to participate as a crew member. You'll live aboard the sloop for an unforgettable week of sailing and teaching. If you're interested in becoming a volunteer, you can find out more at clearwater.org.
Hi, I'm Nate Brogan. Join me for Heart Song Radio, Sunday nights at midnight. We're processing and decompressing from our emotions together.
I must admit I wanted you to save me. Now I'm sat on the ground, feeling half crazy.
Sometimes I talk about therapy stuff.
The shame-bound individual is like a fox that's been trained to hunt itself to exhaustion, while the hounds sit back and enjoy the show.
And sometimes I play some really goofy shit.
Home Depot, 12-foot skeletons.
I wish that I could wear hats without looking like a little lad, or looking like a little league dad, or looking like a guy named Chad.
That's Heart Song Radio, Sunday nights at midnight after Freedom Highway, here on Radio Kingston, AM 1490, FM 1079, or anytime at radiokingston.org.
Hello. Well, for the last 24 and a half minutes or so, I'm going to go out with some more selections from the playlist that Kevin Gosztola, my guest tonight, had put together. The next track on the list is a track by Manu Chao called Words of Truth.
In a land of shame, true words, in 2 words.
still have got lost. They adhere to laws outside the laws and say down by those who don't subscribe to. The world is getting stranger. We'll never lose heart. We can't just wait for the old time to die before we can make a new start. Bring on the revolution. I wanna die for something. Bring on the revolution. Wanna die for something. Wanna die for something. Bring on the revolution. I wanna die for something. Bring on the revolution. Don't wanna die for nothing. For every freedom fighter, I wanna hold on tighter to the hope and will you gave. You were the brave. You were the brave. And one day, when I hear your children sing, freedom will reign, freedom. When we watch the children play, remember how the privileged classes grew, and from this day we set out to undo what won't undo, looking for the grand in the minute. Every breath justifies every step that we take to remove what the powers that be can't do. And the children will understand why. Bring on the revolution. Keep the pressure on. I wanna die for something. Bring on the revolution. Keep the pressure on. I wanna die for something. Bring on the revolution. Wanna die for nothing. Bring on the revolution. I wanna die for something.
That was the Pretenders, the track called Revolution. Before that, we heard Manu Chao with Words of Truth. I'm going to finish the show with a little treat. This is a speech that Julian Assange made, the Sam Adams Awards, the Oxford Union, back in 2013. I thought it'd be kind of interesting to listen to this. And then we'll go out with another track from Kevin Gosztola's playlist.
So I would just firstly like to say congratulations to Tom Finger and a very important talk that he gave. Of course, well made and and politic, but I think there are nuggets in there that are quite important to understand. I was involved in 2007 and 2008 at looking at what was happening to Iran. Now, from that process, I'm fully aware of some of the pressures that were on Tom. A lot of people did a lot of good work. Perhaps the most important was Tom Finger's in trying to correct the movement towards war with Iran based on lies. And it is incredible to think back at those times that it was only in 2003 where the worst modern deception of the Western world occurred, where we went to a war in Iraq based on lies in 2003, and over 100,000 people were killed and millions of Iraqi refugees displaced as a result. Just 3 years later, the drums for war with Iran were being whipped up, not just in the United States, but also in this country. And it's thanks to journalists like Cy Hirsch and professional, truthful insiders like Tom and our sources and the sources for journalists that war hasn't happened yet. For example, in the beginning of 2008, we published Iraq's classified rules of engagement for the US Army. In those rules, there was a section that was apparently designed, or at least permitted, for a border skirmish to start up. It permitted US troops to go into Iran under a variety of circumstances. And at the time, there were disputes in the Gulf with ships approaching one another, a very heated moment, and the US mainstream media and the White House ramping up any little small incident. One of our sources provided us with those classified rules of engagement. We published them in a deal that we set up with the New York Times to get greater impact for it. And as a result, the Iranian government held a press conference and said, don't you dare come over into our territory like that. We then got hold of the next edition of these classified rules of engagement, and that part had been removed from it. The procedures had been tightened up. And if we look back in the history of war, something between 20 and 50% of all wars have started as a result of these border skirmishes. That source has never been revealed. I assume that he or she is happy to have contributed to history and to human rights in that way, and he goes about his business. As opposed to what is sometimes put about, WikiLeaks is not an organization that hates intelligence agencies. Far from it. At its very base, the idea of intelligence is an optimistic one. It's that one can understand the world, one can apply intelligence to understand. The problem is the corruption of those agencies, and that corruption comes about because of secrecy. So when Tom spoke about, in somewhat glowing terms, the improved process that he put down, and I believe him that that is a significant improvement from what was there before, it all rests upon one thing. It rests upon the abilities of people in those agencies to get out information to the public when those processes are not followed. We might have depoliticized analysts working in intelligence agencies who are, to all intents and purposes, mere robots. Perfect machines with perfect accuracy. They are tasked, they engage in the tasks, they analyze, they pass up the information higher up the food chain. And what if, in Tom's case, for example, his national intelligence estimate, there was not a threat that it would be released, because our sources say that in fact the White House knew that if it did not release a version, immediately another version would be released, and the White House would have to get would be then coming second, and its opponents would have their spin on it. So the White House wanted to get their spin on it first. It's only through this pressure of producing analytical product to the public that these sorts of agencies are kept honest and don't become simply robots that are in effect, perhaps it's drawing the bow too far, but some kind of Hitler's willing executioners, mere people who act as robots who are told to carry out a task and do it. That is not enough. It is not enough to agree to carry out a task for superiors. That is the Nuremberg defense. We must all look to ourselves and understand whether what we are doing is right and just, not just according to the views of our superiors, but according to the long view of history, according to human rights and to our feelings of compassion, if we have any. Now, the war for the push to a war with Iran is far from over. The push for a war with Iran is far from over, and the debate now is occurring in the public sphere as well as in various maneuvers by different intelligence agencies, the machinations that are happening in Syria and so on. Now I want to look at some of those. Our cables revealed, for example, that this country, the United Kingdom, engaged in a conspiracy to kill off Press TV, the Iranian state TV station, the Iranian equivalent to the BBC, from being able to broadcast into the United Kingdom. They cut off its satellite feed, which is one of the Sky satellites to this country, the death penalty, effectively, for a national broadcaster. What does that mean? Well, it means that the Iranian government can't get out its view. Iran is surrounded by 45 military bases that are hostile to it on every side. There is no border that Iran does not have that is not already hostile or will probably shortly become so. That produces an atmosphere of intense fear. It produces an atmosphere where they think that there is a war. And as a result, we all know that Great Britain in World War I imprisoned Bertrand Russell, for example, and in World War II there were similar abuses. The Iran fears means that the sort of human rights abuses that we claim about, the human rights abuses that are correctly looked into in Iran, have very little chance of resolution because the leadership of that country is so terrified about being invaded. Now, I want to draw this back to something that is personal to us and personal to WikiLeaks. The internet has become the most important device for revealing the truth, at least since the beginning of the printing press. It has become the #1 antidote to TV. Democracies are always lied into war. The Iraq War was a result of lies. The increase in involvement in the United States in Vietnam was a result of the Gulf of Tonkin incident, another lie. It's not just lies by intelligence analysts, it's lies by the big media machine. And what is in the big media machine? Well, it's the various institutions that get too comfortable and too close to the table of power, the very table.
That was Julian Assange. Believe it or not, that was in 2013. Quite prophetic, in fact, when you apply that same logic to China or Russia, for example. It seems that the same methods are being applied. For example, when Russia invaded Ukraine, the first thing that happened was Russian state RT television. Russian television was completely it's just disappeared. And I know a few hosts, Chris Hedges, Lee Camp, for example, that had shows on RT, and believe me, they were not dictated to in their points of view. They were. I know from conversations with both of those individuals that they had pretty much free rein to even criticize Russia and the government in Russia. So you can see that this pattern continues, and what Julian was talking. The only thing that's really changed, I would say, in response to his statement about the internet is that I think the so-called deep state has now figured out, or is at least trying to infiltrate that medium as well. So that's been a big change, and that's something to be very concerned about. We're going to go out with a track by Calais 13, which features Julian Assange, and it's called Multiviral. So I'll say goodnight. Thank you for tuning in. And if the good Lord's willing and the creek don't rise, we'll see you next week. Be well.
Todo empieza con una llamarada cuando despedimos llamas de nuestras miradas. Quieren detener el incendio que se propaga, pero hay fuegos que con agua no se apagan. Y se acerca la línea policíaca, los músculos se tensan y aumenta la frecuencia cardíaca. Suben los niveles de testosterona y empieza ese momento en el que se enfrentan las personas. Cuando somos amigos del coraje, cuando gritar se convierte en nuestro único lenguaje. A mí me ordena la razón, a ti te ordena un coronel. Si nuestra lucha es de cartón, la de ustedes es de papel. Y no nos paran, porque un mensaje contundente convierte a cualquier teniente en un tiburón sin dientes. El Estado nos teme, porque al mismo tiempo somos 132 y 15M. Si la prensa no habla, nosotros damos los detalles, pintando las paredes con aerosol en las calles. Levanto mi pancarta y la difundo, con solo una persona que la lea ya empieza a cambiar el mundo. Absolutamente bien. Cruda, coro con coro, paso con paso. Crece la ola, crece la espuma, cuando cada vez más gente se suma. El que controla, el que domina, quiere enfermarte para venderte medicina. Y no se endrogan, no se embrutecen. Cualquier pregunta que tengamos la adormecen. Son las mentiras recalentadas, nos alimentan con carne procesada y la gente sigue desinformada. Una noticia mal contada es un asalto a mano armada. Nos infiltramos, nos duplicamos, como las células nos multiplicamos. Al que no quiere caldo se le dan 2 tazas. Somos la levadura que levanta la masa. Nuestras ideas son libres y están despiertas, porque pensamos con las puertas abiertas. Lo que no se ve lo estamos viendo. Nacimos sin saber hablar, pero vamos a morir diciendo. Absolutamente bien. Coro con coro, paso con paso. Crece la ola, crece la espuma, cuando cada vez más gente se suma.
We live in the world that your propaganda made. But where you think you are strong, you are weak. Your lies tell us the truth we will use against you. Your secrecy shows us where we will strike. Your weapons reveal your fear for all to see. From Cairo to Quito, a new world is forming. The power of people armed with the truth.
جمرت من جرارة من عيوننا، ولعت لما عيوننا طلعت، لما عيوننا طلعت.